overcast day in Ottawa. We have people from Latin America, Africa, Europe in here, so I hope your weather is better. Okay, so let me now introduce the lecture, and I'll spend 5 minutes to do that, then we'll have 30 minutes of lecture and 20 minutes plus of questions and answer. My name is Dominique Marshall. I'm the co-owner of the Brown Bag Lunch Series at the Institute of African Studies for 2021. And this is the third of 6 lecture. They are all recorded for future use in teaching and research, and they are present on the website of the Institute of African Studies. I am a historian of the Institute, and together with the Gender Design in STEAM Research Project, we are very glad today to present Trinish Palayashi, who will speak on transport justice in South Africa. Trinish is a policy professional who has had a career both in South Africa and more recently in Canada. In South Africa, she was a senior policy analyst and director of fiscal analysis in the budget office of the National Treasury of South Africa. For the last 2 years, she has had an advisory role in the Canadian federal government, and she speaks to us from Ottawa, where she does gender analysis and policy for policy makers. What she is talking about today is the research she did in London for her master's degree on access to transportation for women in Johannesburg. She is also involved in NGO work, international NGOs, but in particular a group called Finance by Women, and also local NGOs here in Ottawa, is in particular one on refugees. The GDS project, Gender Design in STEAM, is a 3-year project which is financed by the Ottawa-based International Development Research Center, and Carlton is involved. There is a group of about 30 faculty members and graduate students who are acting as the support team and the organizing team to manage grants to 20 projects in the Global South, in Latin America, Africa, and Asia, of teams of people who work in science, technology, engineering, and mathematics, and who are concerned with putting more gender reflection and involving gender problems in their own and current work. The way we're going to work today, a few technical advice. There is a chat box. If you push the chat button at the bottom, and there I will take your comments and questions, and at 1:40 I will start conveying them to Trinish. There won't be any direct question and answer. It's me who will field them, but I will make sure to cover as much as your questions as we can. So use the chat box. You can write to me only or to everyone, and you can start already when Trinish is speaking. If you have any technical problem, please write to Femi, who is the host and who will answer them to you. Thank you very much to Femi from the Institute of African Studies for doing this work. And then when you write your question, please, if you wish, identify yourself. I come from this university, I am from this place, this NGO, and I am talking from Rio de Janeiro. Something like that would be lovely. And I am looking forward to the lecture. And so Trinish, it is up to you now.
Hi, everyone. So a big thank you to the Institute of African Studies at Carleton University for inviting me to give this presentation today, as well as the folks at the Gendered Design in STEM. I also wish to acknowledge everyone in the audience today, including the wider academic community, as well as friends and family, both here in Canada and South Africa. And lastly, to Dominic and Femi, thank you for your guidance and for conducting the logistical arrangements to make this presentation possible. So just to give you a little context, I think as Dominic mentioned, I was a policymaker in South Africa for about 10 years, and I was at the South African National Treasury. And during that time, a lot of the times that we had tabled a government budget, a very common question was what was the impact of the budget on women in South Africa. And so in 2018, I took a year out of studying, out of work, and I went off to University College London to do a master's. And I decided to explore one aspect of public finance and see how women were being impacted. So for me, it was very empowering as an actual policymaker to go out in the field and actually do primary research to address this question. Another purpose of today's presentation is that I'd like to get your feedback on this research, since this is something I'd really like to publish. So just to begin, there are a number of people in the audience who are from South Africa who understand Johannesburg as a city, but for a number of the others, I'd like to give you a little bit of context. So Johannesburg is a city that from its very beginning was shaped by topography and policy. And so we had racial zoning policies such as the Native Urban Areas Act in 1923 and the Group Areas Act in 1950 that created the city's unjust geography that was skewed in favor of a small white minority of the population, with the remaining majority of Black South Africans suffering spatial disadvantage. Racial zoning policies by the apartheid state meant that the average commuting time of Black South Africans was twice as long as the commute as their white South African counterparts. Added to this was the cost of travel. In 1993, just before democracy in South Africa, a study on transport showed that transport accounted for significant expenditure of household expenditures for poor South Africans. The same findings were noted to be true in a 2013 National Household Travel Survey conducted by Statistics South Africa. So the fact that the 1993 findings still persisted more than 2 decades after democracy was achieved indicates that the effects of racial zoning policies were and are still being felt in South African cities. In an attempt to rectify this, in 2013, the city of Johannesburg introduced a corridor-based approach to spatial planning in what is referred to as the corridors of freedom. So essentially, the corridors of freedom is best described as an attempt to restitch the city in order to bring spatial justice to formerly unjust parts. The aim was to link nodes of the city to high-density residential developments, particularly peripheral informal settlements. And Alexandra Township was one such settlement that was targeted under this strategy. So this is just an overview of Alexandra Township. So Alexandra Township is important because while it is not considered geographically peripheral to the core of the city, because it's just about 21 kilometers from the Johannesburg city center, it does suffer from acute levels of transport-based social exclusion. And in many senses, it is a place of economic peripherality. The township of Alexandra was established in 1912, and it covered a landmass of about 800 hectares, and again, just 21 kilometers out of the Johannesburg city center. And initially, the township was aimed to house just about 70,000 people, but the 2011 census data recorded that this population estimate was closer to 250,000. A 2016 World Bank study also showed that more than 60% of residents in Alex were unemployed, with a further 20% living on less than $65 a day, or in the local currency, about 1,000 rand a month. The majority of Alex's residents are Black South Africans, although there's also a sizable population of economic migrants from neighboring countries too. One area of service delivery that is severely lacking in Alexandra Township is that of transport, with the majority of residents having to rely on the modes of transport such as the minibus taxi and a local. So just to give context, the local is essentially a Toyota Avanza, which is a form of informal transport that operates only within Alexandra Township and transports about a maximum of 8 people. So the township's history with transport has been both long and complex. It started with the 1943 commuters bus boycott in response to hiked bus fares, and more recently to the Cow Train project, which is a high-speed rail network, and of course the Corridors of Freedom. So while these 2 projects are aimed at increasing the mobility of Alexandra's residents, the primary and the secondary data shows that this has not been the case. The lived transport experiences of the majority of Alex's residents reflect survival strategies of individuals on the fringes of the city, thereby implying that they choose to remain closer to home and thus limiting themselves from work opportunities and other forms of human and social capital. So in starting to think about the research project, I did a wide scan of the literature just to understand the concepts of social exclusion and how this related more broadly to transport, and then of course how this impacted women. So social exclusion, just to use one of the definitions, the common definitions in the literature by the UK Social Exclusion Unit, is described as the existence of barriers, which makes it impossible for people to participate fully in society. This participation is further defined as everything from economic to social and cultural participation. In this sense, social exclusion is not necessarily a phenomenon that can affect only poor households, and therefore any measure of social exclusion needs to be more multidimensional, multi-layered, and dynamic compared to other metrics such as income. Another pertinent argument in the literature was that social exclusion can act both, is circular, so it can act both as a cause and a driver. So it can be a cause of a lack of personal opportunity and the outcome of a lack of opportunities. One such opportunity is that of transport. However, there are a number of synergies that shape the relationship between social exclusion and transport. These include the nature of time-space organization of households, the nature of the transport system, and also the time-space organization of the facilities or opportunities that these individuals are trying to access. Another pertinent point in the literature was that given the complexity between social exclusion and transport, there wasn't really any operationalized definition that could quantify the social inclusion aspect on transport. Added to this, in instances where there was some literature on social exclusion and transport, the majority of this was conducted mostly in developed contexts, where those being excluded were in the minority, and therefore there was a vacuum in the debate on how these concepts were being applied to developing contexts. In more recent years, this gap is starting to be filled, and we see the rise of a number of concepts, such as transport poverty, which looks at the confluence of poor transport provision and social disadvantage. We also have the spatial approach, which looks at the negative social consequences that are experienced within particular geographical locations, and particularly in areas that are on the fringes of major cities. And then lastly, we have the category approach, which relates to the travel patterns and attitudes of particular social groups, and those who are perceived as a disadvantage in relation to the transport systems, for as an example, women. From an analytical perspective, gender and transport also remains an area that is not well understood because of the multifaceted roles that women assume, which implies that there are a number of paradigms through which their relationship to transport could be understood. Intersectionality also suggests that women also contribute, that differences among women contribute to how transport is experienced. Common approaches in the literature include looking at motherhood, time, poverty, and even safety. A last pertinent point from the literature, and something that I want to emphasize here, is the failure of the public transport system to help women achieve their transport needs results in their social exclusion being exacerbated. So, having done a scan of the literature, I decided to put together a conceptual framework that could then be applied to the primary research questions specifically for Alexandra Township. So this conceptual framework is most comparable to the spatial approach that is identified in the literature. The metrics of land use, transport, supply, time, and income are pertinent to the case of Alex, but also reflect a range of metrics that is already in the literature. For example, the metrics of land use and transport have been adopted in a number of studies on accessibility frameworks. And the metric of land use is particularly relevant for the context of Johannesburg, given the city's legacy of unjust geography that resulted in geographical dislocation for specific racial groups. Investigating transport supply seeks to measure how transport contributes to individual accessing work and education and social opportunities, and particularly how these opportunities then differ for both men and women. Time focuses on the associated trade-offs that come from specific transport choices, since it is commonly assumed that women take on multiple roles in the household and generally make more trips than men. Time will have an important bearing on their travel experiences and their choices. And then lastly, income considers how the impact of travel on household budgets and whether women in the household have agency over their own travel-related expenditure. While some studies caution against the use of income as a reliable measure of travel, numerous other studies also illustrate the importance of understanding the financial burden that is placed on low-income groups in order to undertake travel opportunities. These were the primary research questions that I applied in the study. So the main primary research question was, how does transport impact processes of social exclusion for women? And in addressing this question, there were two other sub-questions, which looked at the nature of travels in Alexandra households, as well as how the nature of both men's and women's travels differed. So in answering these questions, primary research is carried out using a combination of both quantitative and qualitative research instruments. So for quantitative research instruments, I used travel surveys, which were administered to about 115 participants, respondents, 61 of which were women and 54 were men. And interviews were carried out with 5 households in Alex, 3 policymakers, and 1 academic. The research instruments made explicit the 4 metrics identified in the conceptual framework, which were, again, land use, transport, supply, time, and income. The choice to include these multiple metrics reflected 2 considerations. So the fact that the acknowledgement that lack of transport opportunity and transport-related social exclusion are not necessarily synonymous with each other. And secondly, the nature of social exclusion and the fact that it is multidimensional, multi-layered, and dynamic. Qualitative primary data research for the study was conducted through the process of semi-structured interviews, and a qualitative approach was appropriate for a number of reasons, including the exploratory nature of the links between transport and social exclusion that require in-depth and sensitive information, and also the ability to replicate these discussions with similar groups in order to test assumptions or truisms about a specific situation. For the data collection, travel surveys were administered in Alexandra Township, and I think the literature tells us a lot about making a clear distinction between the type of survey that is being applied in the study. So that is the difference between a consumption survey versus a travel survey, since this too can create variability in the assumptions about transport expenditure. Travel surveys include more information about habits pertaining to travel compared to consumption surveys, which are concerned with mainly factual data. From a sampling perspective, there were a number of challenges of conducting sampling in an informal settlements in South Africa and more broadly in Alexandra Township. And this stems largely from the legacy of apartheid and the residual outcome of unjust geography. For the most part, informal settlements in South Africa and Johannesburg remain largely unmapped. So given that the field research was also constrained by a limited time period associated with the master's project, this just took place in 2 weeks over July 2018. And so it became impossible to undertake a random sampling methodological approach to administer the travel surveys. I also had a number of discussions with the African Center of Migration at the University of Witwatersrand in Johannesburg, who provided great insight into the challenges of conducting random sampling in a settlement such as Alexandra, and this was based on their own research projects. The main challenge pertained to the diversity of structural forms and the use of space, which made enumerating a very difficult exercise. As a way to overcome this, quota sampling was used. Reflexivity was also a key consideration before any field research began, specifically being an Indian South African female with knowledge of only English and Afrikaans and none of the other 9 official languages that are more predominantly spoken in Alexandra Township. So as a way to navigate this challenge, I took on the assistance of a student from Wits University. She was a Black South African female, and she helped me with the field research. And having her help on this project had a positive impact on the data collection process, not only for the purposes of translation, but also just being able to negotiate access to the township and to build trust with participants, since I was clearly perceived to be an outsider in that context. Another important point was like my own positionality in designing the section on transport usage in the travel survey. And this became very evident in the first day of data collection. This oversight largely reflected my own perception of what types of public transport mechanisms could be available to people living in townships. And at the time, on the first day, a lot of people started to identify the use of a local, and I had no idea what that was. And so I very quickly managed to edit the survey after the first day of data collection. As identified in much of the literature, the ability to map transport and social exclusion from both a qualitative and quantitative approach is also prone to limitations. And in the context of Alexandra, there were multiple layers of complexity. The first relates to the high amount of migrant populations in peripheral areas, and many of them were dissuaded from participating in the research for fear of being exposed to authorities. Secondly, a travel survey only measures short-term travel behaviors, and so in a sense it misses the long-term structurally defined experiences of travel. Thirdly, the research study took place less than a year before a national election in South Africa. This was compounded by the outcome of the last municipal elections, in which the majority ruling party lost governance over the city of Johannesburg. And so, a common question was that whether we were there from the ANC or whether we were there from the government. And so this meant that the research could have been perceived as pre-election maneuvering. And lastly, during the period of field research, there was a massive fuel price hike that came into effect, thus increasing the price of the minibus taxi fare and local fares in that particular week. And so there was a lot of anger that was evident in the data collection process, and so this could have also impacted responses. I think a very important finding in the secondary data sources was Statistics South Africa, through its National Household Travel Survey, had a plethora of data that was available for long periods of time. And comparatively, having now been here in Canada and trying to look at whether similar surveys exist, it's striking that it doesn't. So yeah, that's one very important comparison I've learned since finishing this research. So moving on to the findings, I have grouped these according to the metrics and the conceptual framework. So on the issue of land use, in common rhetoric among the travels survey respondents and households was the dissatisfaction with the state of the streets in Alexandra, and in particular how this inhibited movement. Such levels of congestion within the township implies that the drivers of the locals were prone to asking passengers to get out of vehicles at a different point than the pre-agreed stop. Many of the respondents did express that how access to a bus system could fundamentally transform their travel experiences, but there was also a clear recognition that the spatial disadvantage, the spatial design and the geographical evolution of Alex meant that this was a dream that would not necessarily materialize in the near term. The impact of navigating streets within Alexandra Township was influenced even the most mundane household tasks, such as shopping. So if you look at the figure that's illustrated on this slide, you'll see that the shopping trips undertaken by the travel survey respondents. So the majority, that's about 74%, of the shopping trips included just one stage of travel, and this typically took place within Alexandra Township. This supported the claims in the literature that since women are responsible for a variety of household roles and tended to travel across a variety of locations, they adapted their travel strategies accordingly. As you can see, the frequency of women traveling for shopping was higher than that of men. And there was one possible explanation that was given, in that it's very difficult to carry all of your groceries in the local, and this is largely a product of space and what is allowed, what you're allowed to carry in. And so women had to go back many times. Despite the high propensity of women traveling for shopping, the average cost associated with this travel was almost half compared to what men spent on when they traveled to go shopping. This highlighted a number of factors, including men having more decision-making powers over the household spending and enjoying higher access to private vehicles, while women chose to shop locally for convenience. There were a number of new developments, such as the Alexandra Mall and the Pan-African Shopping Center located in Alexandra, that have addressed the gap of spatial dislocation by providing residents with a wide array, a variety of shops that are found elsewhere in the city. But in a sense, this also has the potential to then entrench their peripherality from the rest of the city. So this table provides us an overview of transport usage in the travel survey. The data illustrates that spatial dislocation is experienced in Alexandra Township, with close to 90% of both men and women recording walking as a common part of their travel experience. Conversely, other non-motorized modes of travel, such as bicycle usage, did not feature at all in any of the travel experiences of the respondents. Despite Alexandra being located to one of the major stops of the car train, high-speed train route, the percentage of the sample that made use of this was very low. And this is mainly related to the high level of pricing of an average ticket. Respondents also explained the difficulty in setting up appointments to do various things outside of peak hours because of the uncertainty of how long you would end up waiting to get transport to get there. Another finding was that transport supply diminished even further on the weekends, which then also impacted social activities. Left with the only alternatives of walking and minibus taxis or the use of locals, Alexandra's residents are often subjected to bad driver behavior. A common theme pertaining to driver behavior that most female respondents expressed was the feeling of being unsafe. Not only were they subjected to verbal abuse, but there was also a high perception that traveling in a taxi late at night or even alone during daylight hours made them more susceptible to gender-based violence. Finally, the constant tension between the minibus taxi industry and the government leads to transport strikes. And this means a lot of the time that travelers who depend on this mode of transport are left stranded with little or no alternatives. And in instances where they choose to use rideshare services such as Uber or Taxify, this becomes a very costly alternative. Moving on to the findings for time, with the exception of visiting families and going to university, most of which was undertaken on a part-time basis, the longest recorded travel trip was spent traveling to go look for work. The amount of time spent going to work that I had found in my own research was out of sync with the travel time noted in the 2013 National Household Travel Survey. And this sort of reflected three things. Number one, Alex's proximity to the Johannesburg city center, which is why the area is not necessarily considered to be peripheral. Proximity to work opportunities. So typically, a lot of the respondents engaged in low-paid domestic labor in the surrounding suburbs of Sandton. And then lastly, the respondents' exclusion of waiting times as part of their travel experiences. While many of the travel survey respondents did not include time as part of the average time associated with the trip, they noted that time spent waiting for transport and time spent waiting in transport as one of the biggest downsides to their travel experiences. In order to compensate for the lost time, many of the respondents noted leaving home for work before 6 a.m. in order to offset the unexpected time lost during travel. It became evident that the trade-off associated with leaving home at such early hours is job security, and was very succinctly captured in one of the responses of the respondents, who just said, "I just can't afford to be late." And then lastly, looking at income. So while the majority of the residents in the travel survey thought that it was fairly easy to access transport in Alexandra, they felt that the overall transport supply was far too expensive. In this regard, cost stands out as a clear inhibitor to accessing transport opportunities. Access to income was a key factor in being able to afford a number of transport from a number of respondents, and they also they were displeased with the exorbitant pricing system associated with the minibus taxi. They found that commuters suffered from a lack of consultation from the private transport operators, and that the government offered no intervention to address the pricing system. The identified travel trade-offs were also clearly not just related to monetary. For example, a number of respondents noted that they first paid for their child's school transportation before they made any other household expenditure decisions related to travel. As one respondent had said, "Once I pay for my child's school transport, I then decide if I can go to church. And if I can't afford to go to church, then I just stay at home." There was also an overall reticence to travel with young children. One female respondent noted that when she traveled with her infant grandchild, she could not feed him his bottle inside a taxi because the taxi driver didn't want any mess inside his taxi. Other female respondents also noted how traveling with a small child made you particularly open to abuse, and how the child was not allowed to either eat inside the vehicle or occupy even a vacant seat. The opportunity cost of visiting family was also less of a concern in the hierarchy of household travel needs compared to other types of travel in the travel surveys. And the associated costs of visiting family resulted in a lower frequency of such trips in the overall sample. The disparate findings for women traveling to work also surface in the data on women seeking work. Men on average spend more time per week looking for work opportunities. The most interesting finding was that about 36% of the total sample considered themselves as unemployed but actively seeking work. But only close to half of these individuals could not travel to look for work. This points to a cyclical problem of how lack of resources prevents individuals from seeking income opportunities, thus entrenching their poverty further. For Alexandra's residents, a lack of transport opportunity resulted in over-reliance on minibus taxis and locals as the main modes of motorized transport, thus rendering commuters susceptible to high pricing and the associated personal dangers of using this unregulated service. The use of locals was also noted as a contextualized form of transport within Alexandra Township that supported the argument that people are not necessarily passive in the face of transport disadvantage and respond accordingly to cope with their situations. Transport-based social exclusion was particularly evident for women, and they faced high transport penalties. Almost all of the women that were surveyed and interviewed relied on locals, taxis, and walking as their main mode of transport. And even in instances where there was a privately owned vehicle in the household, there was a limited opportunity for women in the household to make use of it. In all instances, women were tasked with managing the responsibilities of getting children to school and shopping, and therefore made more trips than male members of a household. The responsibility on women to manage multiple aspects of the household illustrated the various roles women assume and the trade-offs that come from these roles. In some accounts, women chose to forego their own travel opportunities to go look for work, go to church, or even visit family members if the economic well-being of the household was compromised. The men interviewed also showed little understanding of the dangers that women face when they use transport, and women noted their own experiences of abuse and gender-based violence and how this subsequently impacted their travel strategies. Transport, like so many other socioeconomic metrics in the country such as South Africa, illustrates the starkness of the inequality faced by those who are socially and economically peripheral, with the case of Alexandra Township being one example of transport-based social exclusion. And then lastly, advocating for a more gender-based approach to transport planning in South Africa may not necessarily be realistic in the near term, since the broader concept of transport and social exclusion has not yet been enunciated in South African policy and implementation circles.
Thank you very much, Trinish. Before we say anything, maybe you could show this next slide. This is, I just want you to have a look, because this last time we look at the slides at the upcoming talks, one next week, one in February, and one in March, one about the EU, one about biographies, and one about magic, anthropology, and museums. So I hope you will come. And I was reminded, listening to Trinish, of a talk we had last year about schooling in the townships and the structural problem of access to schooling. And there are so many things that are similar to what you've said, Trinish. So I will welcome questions in the chat box, please. Write them there, and you can tell a little, you know, I am such a body from such a place, and here is my comments on my question. And as I am waiting for them, I will ask them myself, and Trinish, you can stop the slideshow there, and we'll just have the two of you, and I will field the question to Trinish. So please write your comments and question in the chat box. So as I'm waiting for them, I'll take the privilege of the host there to tell you that it was very good to see, especially for the people of the gender design a group, how you deal with gender and how you put household and the comparison between men and women in the middle of your gender analysis. So really, you're not only focusing on women, but on household and men and women to understand gender better. And also you spoke about generations, like how, I mean, it's, for me, that was unexpected. I was thinking women grocery shopping, not women bringing the children to school. And so this whole business of children and schooling is right in the middle of the inequalities. And also I was expecting a real difference between the time and the money of men and women. But what you're saying is it's the number of trips really, which is really at the core of everything. And then you bring to this whole study a lot of rich concepts, like the idea of trade-off between time and money, which is really interesting. So here's a question after my comments. Were you to do this again, what would you change that you've not said already about your difficulties? And also, because a lot of the teams in our gender design people are stuck home because of the pandemic, were you to do this without going in the township, would it even be possible? Because you spoke so much about the importance of being there and bringing your research assistant and all that. Thank you.
Okay, so I'll start with the first question. I don't think that a study of this nature would necessarily be possible in an online way. Again, just referring back to the slides about the socio-economic metrics of the majority of people in Alexandra Townships. We're talking about people who live on less than $65 a day, informal structures. There's no access to electricity. There's no access to any formal infrastructure. So I don't think that it'll be necessarily possible. You probably could get on the qualitative side and a few people who would give you long interviews, but I don't think on the quantitative side it would be possible. What I would do differently, I think I would definitely use a longer period of data collection. Again, this was done for the context of a master's project, so I was limited by time. I would love to have a larger data sample, so that you could use more qualitative data techniques. Yeah.
Okay, so our first question comes from Melanie, who is asking, we're saying some cities separate transport by gender. Do you think this would be useful or feasible in Alex? Or more generally, would you advocate this separation? Melanie is an associate professor of law at Carleton, and she teaches human rights and gender.
Okay, so just to double check, the question is to whether we should have separate transport policies for men.
Do this already. Would it be useful or feasible in Alex? Or more generally, do you even advocate that kind of separation?
I think given the nature of the structural nature of just transport disadvantage, I would start with beginning addressing transport supply. And once that is corrected, then have a more gendered approach to it. Because at present, the problem is the transport supply and the lack of transport opportunities more generally.
Okay, Shireen has a question. Shireen, I was asking people to write their questions, but maybe if you want to show on your video, please just put your video on and Femi will let you in if you prefer to do it this way.
Oh, I think, yeah, thanks so much. I prefer to do it this way. Take too long to write. So I want to say thanks to Trinish for the paper. As far as I know, Trinish, there hasn't been a similar kind of study in South Africa at all. So this is really path-breaking. And given that you are a policy expert, I think I agree with you that there's no point in advocating for this a separate kind of policy around this. But I wonder what you think the possibilities are for linking this question of safety and accessibility and reliability, all those rich details that you showed, to broader social policy debates. The one that I think it could, for example, be quite productively linked to is the welfare debates on the use of the social grants. And there is some separate research, not looking at transport, but some studies by the Center for Social Development in Africa at the University of Johannesburg, Leila Patel's Research Institute, which looks at how social grants get used. And one of the findings is how much of social grants are used for things that they should not be used for, because we are meant to have a joined up social policy so that if you're on the grants, you shouldn't have to pay for schooling. You shouldn't have to pay for kids' transport to schooling. You shouldn't have to pay for, you know, it's just a range of those things. And I think within that kind of literature, your research really speaks to the way in which the impact of the grants gets eroded by such a large chunk being used up in areas that they really shouldn't be. Do you know what I mean? So I wonder if there's a policy efficiency argument to be made rather than a specifically feminist argument. But sometimes that makes gets more traction in government circles than saying these are women's special interests, right? So if we made it about the efficiency of the social grant system, whether that might change the approach.
I completely agree with you. Again, you know, saying that we need to have a policy-specific debate. One way in which we could possibly measure this, I mean, given that we have a national household travel survey, we could do a national household income survey and those who collect social grants and look at how that expenditure is disaggregated. I think a large part of the problem is also like the, you know, the division of powers in South Africa. There's also a mechanism through the local conditional grants that come from the South African National Revenue Fund to link policy mechanisms within the local government conditional grants.
Okay.
Thank you.
Mary Grace has a question. Mary Grace is in the GDS program and she works on questions of transportation in Rwanda, transportation systems in Rwanda. And she is asking, how long was your questionnaire? Did people give you flexible time? She has an experience with transport in South Africa, and normally when you're going to take a bus or a train, a person come on time and they don't wait.
Okay, that's a very good question. So the travel survey, it was about 2 pages long. It had 14 questions. Yeah, so on average, I didn't really experience a lot of people not willing. I think there was a lot of interest. Again, I think part of this was being an outsider in the township, which had impacted the research. There was also a lot of questions as to why we were conducting the research.
Very nice.
Sorry.
Yes. Is it Mary?
Yeah, is this Mary Grace? I wish also to know how, if the question was for only 14 questions, how did you measure that are strong enough to respond on your questions? Because we are now doing a research on transport, gender transport in Rwanda, but we have many questions.
Yeah, so the questions were very succinct and very much tied to the conceptual framework. So on average, there were 3 questions per conceptual framework, and there were 2 questions right at the outset for the demographic data. So again, there was a lot of background research on the conceptual frameworks to make the survey as succinct as possible. And also, again, you know, as you mentioned, a lot of people are in a hurry and don't have time necessarily to answer. So bearing that in mind, the questions were very specific and included a number of measures that could be measured. Yeah. I'm also happy to share the survey with you if you want.
Sure. Thank you very much.
Okay, so you can write to us, Mary Grace, and we'll put you in contact with Trinish. So Blair Rutherford, who is the head of the Sociology and Anthropology Department at Carleton, tells you that it was a great talk and he has to leave soon, but he is asking you, can you talk a bit about the transportation supply? How are taxis, minibuses, and locals regulated, including in supply? And then he's asking also, can you mention how they are gendered? From his limited experience in taxis in Joburg, and similar transport elsewhere in the region, the drivers and conductors are almost always men, and they themselves aren't necessarily focused on trying to make the ride safe, particularly for women passengers. Do you have a sense of this?
Okay, so in terms of the transport supply, as I noted in my research, like I had never heard of what a local was until I had gone into Alexandra Township. There was no regulation beyond just, you know, local buses, so similar to taxi buses within the township. That's how they were regulated, because they had a lot of unlicensed drivers, and because it wasn't, it operated outside of the formal taxi system where there's a lot of competition. It only existed within the confines of the township, which meant that there couldn't be much regulation, especially from the Metro Police in Johannesburg. And it was commonly understood that use of the local would only be within the township and to the major taxi rank. In terms of the minibus taxi industry in South Africa, that remains largely unregulated. In terms of buses, we did try to have, you know, a Ria Via, a bus system which is modeled along the Colombian experience of bus rapid transit systems. This, I would say, is regulated to some extent by the at the city level. It's also regulated by the amount of the fact that they're, you know, supported by conditional grants. But I would say on average for locals and minibus taxis, they remain largely unregulated. The gendered experiences came out very strongly. Again, you know, just listening to women's experiences, women are not treated very kindly within the minibus taxi industries with making use of the taxi. Gender-based violence is huge. So that clearly did come out.
Okay, thank you. So when I asked Trinish about best examples or best practices, she said that a lot, like she just said now, a lot of what she had read, which was interesting, came from Latin America. And Laura McDonald, the political scientist at Carleton and Latin Americanist, has a question, and she'll come on screen.
Hi there. Hi,
Hello.
Trinish. Thank
Hi.
you so much. I really enjoyed your talk. I actually didn't realize you were working on this, so this is really exciting. Yeah, so I've been doing work with Jill Weigel, who's in the geography department, and colleagues at Wilfrid Laurier and University of Toronto on women in transportation systems in Mexico City, focusing on the issue of gender-based violence that are encountered. And there is work, I've seen something on South Africa on gender-based violence in South Africa and systems that are developed to address that, but I'm not sure where I saw it, so I'd have to look for it. But I just wanted to sort of comment and ask about intermodal. Is there intermodal transport? Because it's what we see a lot in Mexico in general, in Latin America in general, is people use the minibuses and then transfer to the subways, say. And a lot of the issues of violence are related not just to what's happening on the transportation mode, but what's happening on the walk to the transportation mode, or in corridors connecting different modes of transportation. So and in general, I also wanted to ask about if you've seen work of Women in Cities International, which is based in Montreal. And they promote gender-based safety audits that have been used in cities around the world, including Mexico City. It's a very influential group. And so they do local participatory sort of mapping sessions with women who go to their, walk through their transportation route and identify particular scenes that are particularly problematic, whether they, often because of lighting issues or pavement or whatever. So I just thought I'd offer that. But yeah, I think it's really interesting study, and the issues around time are just like dramatic. In Mexico City, people talk about spending like 2 to 3 hours each way on their trips.
Yeah.
It's just overwhelming. sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, I must say thank you so much for pointing out the work that's been done in Montreal, and definitely intermodal transport. Like on average, in this presentation, I couldn't show you all of the data, but once if you want, I can share the broader paper with you, and it shows how the average trip includes walking until you reach a point where you could take a local. The local then gets you to the taxi rank. The taxi rank, in many instances, connects you to downtown Johannesburg, where you take another taxi to go home. Walking again has been like, so common in the travel experience, and a lot of the women in the context of the study of Alex actually walked to the surrounding suburbs of Sandton, Buccleuch, Kelvin, and so this actually, impacted their work hours because of the sense of safety. So, as an example, my brother lives in one of the suburbs relative to Alex, and his helper has to leave by 4 p.m. because anything later makes that little period of walking just so tremendously unsafe. And so, very comparative in experiences.
And I would just add that Mexico City has done amazing work on trying to improve women's experience with transportation, and especially issues of violence. And so I think it is a really good example. And there are like groups of cities that meet internationally to share these types of policies. So even if the federal governments or national governments aren't doing much, the subnational governments are often more active, particularly in the case of Mexico City, because it's been run by left-wing political administrations since it democratized. So it's a really good example to look at.
Well, thank you. I'll definitely.
Thank you.
Okay, we'll stop in about 10 minutes. We have 1 comment, 2 questions, and if you have other questions over there, I can field them until in about 10 minutes from now. Thank you so much, everyone. So Shireen is telling us that people of South Africa are amazed about bicycles, the use of bicycles here. And then Tui, who heads the program of disability studies here at Carleton, is asking about any kind of accommodation for disabilities in South Africa. Mary Grace said in the chat box, there is no such thing in South Africa, but we'd like your comment on this. That's number 1.
I would agree, having worked in the Pretoria City Centre, having commuted every day from the Johannesburg City Centre, it is very rare to see accommodations for people with disabilities like you would see here in Ottawa. You get the OC para transfer. Nothing of that kind exists in South Africa. And so one would have to rely, on private transport mechanisms, which then come with an associated cost.
The next one, the next question is from Wazir, who is, works in architecture and is in the GDS program as well, asking about visualization of the data in South Africa. If you have anything of the kind that Laura mentioned, the Montreal group is doing to visualize and do maps with the kind of data that you know.
Yeah, so the GCRO, which is based in South Africa, they do a lot of work on maps, a lot of ArcGIS data. They do a lot of transport surveys, so they were one of the policymakers that I had consulted. So if I want, I can direct you to the website over there.
And Shireen has just suggested some of the some maps as well. And I know that Jill, Laura, is also working with some of the groups, the 3 groups who work in transportation, and showing them the kind of software that these people are using in Montreal to help mapping things. So thank you for all of this. Then there's a basic question from Morgana. I was wondering if you could expand on how jurisdiction and division of regional borders enables or is a challenge for regulations in efforts for safe travel. If there is no time, there's no problem, but yes, we still have a few minutes for you to answer that. Thank you.
I think I'll probably have to get back on that, but yeah, like every city in Johannesburg has its own metro authority which regulates transport. So for example, in the Gauteng province where Johannesburg is situated, they have the Gauteng Metro Police, Johannesburg Metro Police. And if you go to the Pretoria City Centre, they have their own Tshwane Metro Police. So I think that sort of answers the question, I think.
Okay. I think at this point, I don't see any other question. I see a lot of nice comments, and Femi will make sure to copy what's in the chat box, and we'll keep a record of it and send it to Trinish. So what remains is for me to thank you so very much for sharing these results, and I hope that the questions and comments have been somehow useful in the preparation of your next article. You also told me that you are aiming in future research to talk about environmental issues, and we wish you all the best for this. And before we all thank Trinish, I invite you same time next week for a wonderful tour of the trip that Émile Tordet, Belgian anthropologist or proto-anthropologist, did in the Congo with his magical elephant to collect objects for the British Museum. So thank you so very much, Trinish, and all the best in your future work.
Great.